Well, that's the kind of introduction I like. Short and sweet and to the point. Thank you. Okay. Well, we have a lot of information to cover today, and we're going to be dealing today with a relatively new field of science called biomimetics. And biomimetics, of course, bio comes from the Greek meaning life, and mimetics simply means mimicry or copying things that God himself originated. He thought them up, he engineered them, he put them in the world of biology. And a lot of scientists and engineers today have come to the conclusion that whenever we face an engineering challenge or we need a new invention to fit a new application, that instead of trying to do the R&D all on our own and try to figure it out from scratch, it's a really good idea to look at the world of biology, because a lot of the engineering solutions that we find applicable in our own technology have already been solved in the amazing world of biology. And consequently, many like Janine Benyus and other scientists have said we should always ask the biomimetic question: has this problem been addressed and answered in the world of biology? And if so, how can we appropriate that and copy that excellent design? Now, she, of course, and other evolutionists say there's genius in nature, but it didn't come from the genius of a creator. It came from millions of years of natural selection and mutations and all that, which is, of course, none of those things are genius, and they're not even intelligent. But they recognize they recognize the amazing design, but they do not give credit to the creator. Well, today we're going to give credit to the creator, for sure. So biomimetics means simply that God invented it first, and he deserves the glory and should get the credit. Now, in looking in the world of biology, we have not only found that there's things that we can copy, and in fact, there's so many that have application that I actually have 4 different presentations, which I have back there on DVD, on the topic of biomimicry. Today I'm doing part 3, just because it's a little bit longer, and I have usually a little bit more time when I teach here at DSA, so we can go into a little bit more detail. But all of them are very good and are very interesting, very easy to understand, and I think will be a blessing to all of you. Anyway, so God invented it first, and he does indeed deserve the glory. So we're going to look at a number of things, not only that we have tried to copy because they represent such good design, but in looking at biology, man has found that a lot of things we thought we had innovated, we thought it up, we engineered it, we invented it. Actually, somebody thought of it before. And if it took our intelligence to invent it in the first place, it must have taken intelligence for the one who thought of it first and invented it first. And many things that we thought we had made and originated actually were already there from the beginning of creation in the world of biology. God thought of it and invented it first. Now, one thing, of course, body armor. Here we have a bronze breastplate, and armor is something that's been around from ancient times, from biblical times, ancient Greeks and Romans, probably clear back to since the fall of man. Man has thought, well, it'd be nice to have some armor. It's amazing to me that so often they put a 6-pack on the armor. It's like, I have to cover up my 6-pack, but I want the enemy to know that under here I've got something that looks like this, make me look more macho. But of course, man was not the first one to originate the idea of armor. We have, for example, the Ankylosaurus dinosaur, very much armored, and the armadillo, which was named actually by the Spanish. Anybody know what armadillo means in Spanish? It means little armored thing. Yeah, very appropriate name. Now, the problem with the Ankylosaurus and the armadillo, of course, are that underneath they don't have much armor. And so they have that soft underbelly that is vulnerable. And if they get turned over, they're quite vulnerable indeed. Well, the same problem with just having a breastplate is that your arms, your neck, your legs, everything else is exposed. Well, by the Middle Ages, they had come up with good enough technology in refining steel that they could make good quality plate steel. And for the first time in history, man came up with what was called a full suit of armor. But even this is not a full body suit in the ultimate sense. They do have chainmail down here in the crotch. You need a little room there to sit on the horse and everything, but a spike can go right through that chainmail. Also, if you disarm, not disarm, but dismount the knight, the slit in the helmet, dagger will go right through there. So there are points of vulnerability. But God was the first one to invent an armored creature where there is no vulnerability. If you cannot penetrate the armor, the creature is truly invulnerable, and that is the box turtle. The box turtle pulls his head and his front legs in, and there's a hinge here, and pulls this trapdoor shut. Pulls in his rear legs and his tail, and the hinge here allows this trapdoor to shut, and there simply is no vulnerable place. If you can't get past the armor, you can't do anything to the box turtle. So God not only invented it first, he invented it even better. Now here we have the Elizabethan Man of War. Traditionally, ships are called by female names. But when they decided to put a lot of armament on these ships, a lot of cannon, they thought, well, we don't want to call it a woman of war. So they decided, we'll call it a man of war. You have a little more macho sound to it and make the enemy a little more terrorized. But even this concept of having a sailing ship with formidable armament is not something that man thought of first. God thought of and invented it first with this amazing creature, the Portuguese, what's it called? Man of war. And this is not a jellyfish. It doesn't, undulate to maneuver itself. It has this inflatable sail on it. And so it's primarily moved around just like a sail ship by the ocean breezes. Currents can also move it somewhat too. And it is formidably armed with these tentacles that are armed with terrible neurotoxin. And they can dangle down, in some cases, as much as 150 feet. Now that's the record, about 150 feet. Usually it's only about 30 to 35 feet on the average, but it can sometimes get quite a bit longer than that. So the first one to invent a sail ship with formidable armament that deserves the title of a man of war was not man, but God, with the Portuguese man of war. Now, the diving bell has been around for centuries. It's not real high-tech technology. It's basically the idea of taking a bell-shaped metal object that can trap air in it. And the advantage, of course, is that prior to the invention of the diving bell, you had to free dive. They didn't have scuba gear back then. And so you had to take a deep breath and dive down. So you're trying to dive on some sunken treasure and salvage it. And unfortunately, you can only hold your breath so long. So you dive down, gather as much as you could, put it in a basket that they could raise back up to the ship. You have to come up and catch your breath for a while, then go back down. So all kinds of time was wasted going to and from the sunken treasure. Whereas if you put a diving bell right next to it, you simply go inside the diving bell, catch your breath there, and come right back out. Much more efficient. But even this relatively simple technology and idea is not something man invented first. God thought of it and invented it first with this amazing creature, which is called the diving bell spider. The diving bell spider has special hairs and silk on its abdomen that are really good at trapping a bubble around its abdomen, and then it goes down and makes its own diving bell under the water. It uses spider silk, which ounce for ounce is stronger than steel, and it also is transparent where it can see through it. Now, the diving bell spider does not have gills. It has to have air to breathe. It can't extract oxygen out of the water like a fish with gills. So it has to have that air. So it makes its own diving bell out of spider silk. It goes down under there, scrapes that bubble off of its abdomen until it fills it up. And then it'll sit inside there and peer out. And when it sees some prey passing by, it'll free dive out and grab it and come back and devour it within its own little clear diving bell. So again, God was the first one to think of this amazing idea and to invent an amazing creature capable of producing it. Now, for centuries, man has admired the structure of the honeycomb. And in fact, it represents mathematical perfection. If you want a design that allows the greatest strength with the least expenditure of material and can give great strength even with a relatively soft material. For example, the honeycomb is made out of wax. The bees actually manufacture that wax on glands on the underside of their abdomen, and they take that wax and have been programmed in their DNA, I don't believe by random mutations, but by someone who was a mathematical genius to make these honeycombs, and with just the right angles, so it represents mathematical perfection. Even the caps on them, the rhombuses of them we can show with calculus, is the most efficient design. Now, I don't think the bees are mathematical geniuses, but I think the one who created them is. And that's why we see this amazing structure and this amazing programming in them to produce the structure. But because of the tremendous strength that it has when it's put in this hexagonal design, you can get just 2.2 pounds of honeycomb, and it can hold a full 50 pounds of honey. And it's just wax, for goodness sake. When you make it out of even stronger material than wax, it has great strength with the least amount of expenditure of material, and it can be very lightweight. Something that's strong and lightweight has a lot of applications, and that has been recognized for centuries. For example, some 2,000 years ago, the Romans built in Rome this building. Anybody know what this building is? It's the Roman Pantheon. Pan means all, and theon refers to gods, and so it's a temple to honor all the gods. And as you can see, it is quite large. If you can take a look at the size of the people at the base of the pillars there, just in the portico and the entrance, which is not even as big and as tall as the actual Pantheon itself, you can see it is a massive structure. And yet, in ancient times, they built this huge freestanding dome. It looks quite impressive on the inside. At the top, it has a skylight. We weren't the first ones to figure out how to invent a skylight. The ancient Romans did. They called it an oculus, which means an eye, to let the sun's rays in, and it does work very effectively indeed. Now, on the interior, it has this rather square or rectangular patterns on the dome. But on the inside, they found an interesting design feature. When they were doing refurbishment and checking for structural integrity, they found that on the interior of the dome, it's made out of a honeycomb pattern. The Romans realized that the honeycomb represented the perfection when it comes to strength and yet lightweight material. You can't beat it. As the old adage says, if you can't beat them, join them. So they made it out of a honeycomb pattern, and that's exactly what you want for a freestanding dome. You don't want it to collapse under its own weight, and so the greatest strength with the least expenditure of material, with the least weight, is the optimum way to go. And so this has been copied, literally biomimicry, for thousands of years. Here we have the honeycomb pattern in a BMW, and many cars on the interior where they need strength, and it's not gonna, this actually would be covered up, but where you need strength, but you don't want it to be heavy. You don't want a car to be too heavy, or it can't go very fast, and it won't be very efficient on gas. But this pattern is used in the 20th and 21st century in automobiles. It's used in weapons. This is a new grenade launcher developed by the military, 40 millimeter grenade launcher. Amazingly, this thing was completely produced by 3D printing. Yeah, and yes, they can print in metal nowadays. They have a device that will heat the metal to its melting point and then print it out in its liquid form, just like ink. And so the steel alloy trigger guard, trigger and safety, is made out of metal. The aluminum alloy launching tube is made out of metal, all 3D printed. The rest is made out of high-strength polymer, but notice for the handle, they use the honeycomb design. Why? Again, because you can't beat it. If we could improve on it, we would, but after thousands of years in the 21st century, we're still copying this design that God came up with in the first place. Also, especially in the aerospace industry, you find a lot of use of the honeycomb design in the fuselage, in the wings, in the vertical and horizontal stabilizers. It was used even in the space shuttle because you just can't beat the efficiency. The strength to weight ratio is perfect. And what they found, though, is that the honeycomb pattern will transmit noise quite efficiently. But if they do this new design that they've come up with, where they put a kind of a rubberized gasket in the middle of the honeycomb design, it really dampens the noise significantly. So newly manufactured aircraft and even helicopters that employ this new design will be much quieter than we've ever had before. Still using God's design with a honeycomb, but adding a little something to it for our modern technology to cut down on the noise. So God came up with it first. The ancients recognized it and have copied it. We copy it to this day in the 21st century. And indeed, if you cannot beat it, you join it. And so in many times, we have looked at the world of biology and found such perfect design that we can't improve on it really, so we simply copy it. Now God gave this wisdom also to the wasps, who made their hexagonal combs not out of wax. They're not able to produce wax with glands the way bees are, but they go out and harvest wood fiber, and they masticate it or chew it up very fine, and they have natural, kind of like a biological superglue in the special proteins in their saliva. And so it actually makes very strong paper, stronger than most of our paper is usually. You can find these things out in the woods, that have been there for years. Come back years later, it's still there, it hasn't deteriorated. very, very strong recipe that God made for this. But this is something, again, that God did first. Making wood out of paper is very commonplace today, making out of wood fiber. But originally, paper was made out of things like linen and cotton. We still use cotton today for things like currency, because it tends to wear a little better than wood fiber paper. But as far as something that's readily available and easier to process, more efficient to use, hard to beat wood fiber paper. And that's why almost all paper to this day is made of the design that God originally gave in his wisdom to the wasps. In fact, a scientist by the name of René Antoine Reaumur, he pointed out that the American wasps form very fine paper. They teach us that paper can be made from the fibers of plants without the use of rags and linens. See, it used to be, there would be a rag man, who'd go around house to house. You got any old rags you want to get rid of? He'd give you maybe a penny or two for them. He'd gather them all up and take it down to the paper mill, which in those days used primarily linen, and they'd recycle those rags, and almost all paper at that time was made out of linen. But he says, well, hey, these wasps can do it out of plant fiber. Maybe we can copy that. And of course it has been copied and is the most widely used means of making paper to this day. So he says, it seems to invite us to try whether we cannot make a fine and good paper from the use of certain woods. And indeed, that has worked very well, but God had the wisdom to do it first and gave that tremendous ability to the wasps. Now, antifreeze, of course, is something man must think that he invented first, but when we look in the world of biology, we find that God beat us to the punch there too. With a couple of creatures, there's a number of creatures that have this biological antifreeze, but we'll look at just a couple of them here. The eastern box turtle and the wood frog. These are cold-blooded reptiles, and yet they're able to range up into the northern United States, into Canada, even up into Alaska, where it gets bitterly cold in the winter. And in the winter, they simply burrow and bury themselves, not very deep at all. Maybe they have at most about an inch of soil and leaves or debris to insulate them, which is not that much. In fact, if you go out and dig these up during the winter, you would swear they're absolutely dead. They're stiff, like they're dead with rigor mortis, and they feel as cold as ice, and you figure, my golly, this poor thing is dead. But because God gave them this antifreeze, which if they didn't have the first time they needed it, they'd go extinct at the first hard winter, made primarily of glucose and other anti-cryogenic proteins. And this goes out and it's released at the right time when they need it, not before when they don't need it, or not later after they're already frozen. But at the right time, it senses the environmental conditions, releases this, and it saturates its body in such a way that it prevents ice crystals from forming in the cell structure, which would do fatal damage. So they look like they're dead, they're stiff, they look like they're frozen, but they're not. The antifreeze has preserved their vital components of life. However, they do appear to die. Their heart stops beating and remains stopped through the winter. And yet, there's some kind of an elaborate feedback mechanism, some kind of temperature mechanism that senses when the temperature is back up good enough to where it can revive, it kickstarts that heart, and it's almost like they resurrect from the dead. And the God who does raise the dead gives us here, I believe, a type and a shadow of resurrection from the dead. And he gave this amazing ability to these creatures by inventing something long before we thought of it and invented it. He invented the original biological antifreeze. Now, deer hunters will do just about anything to bag a deer, and that includes going to the ignoble fate of putting deer urine on them if necessary, or at least putting it near their deer stand. And the idea is, if you have a urine, that from a doe in estrus, well, buck might like to check that out. Or urine from other male bucks, they might want to, say, well, there's somebody I'm going to fight with to get my harem. So this idea of making yourself smell like something you're not in order to get an advantage over your opponent is not something new. God thought of it first, and he gave that amazing ability to, of all things, the death's head moth. The death's head moth is aptly named because it has what looks like a skull with two big eye sockets on its back there. And it likes to sneak in at night and siphon off honey from the honeycomb, which is really a dangerous way to make a living. Because There's all kind of soldier bees, guard bees, at the entrance to the hive, and their purpose in life is to stop any intruder that tries to come by. Now, the most important thing in being allowed into a beehive is the very specific pheromone that that particular beehive has. And there could be a nearby beehive, but its pheromone will be slightly different. And if a bee comes from that nearby hive and makes a mistake and tries to go into the wrong hive, he looks like a bee, he flies like a bee, he crawls like a bee, but if he tries to crawl past those guard bees, they will throw him out. And if he keeps trying to get in, they'll kill him. Because you got to smell right if you want to get in. And you got to have the right pheromone, and it's very specific. Every hive has a different pheromone-specific smell that you have to gain entrance. Well, the death's head moth doesn't look that much like a bee. You know, when it folds its wings back, it looks a little more like a bee. But at night, when you can't see that well, the bees rely much more on smell than on sight. And so the death's head moth will come near to the hive, and it will smell that hive-specific pheromone. And it takes it in, it has some kind of a chemical factory in it that will analyze the components of that, and it'll make a counterfeit pheromone that mimics it very effectively. And then it will exude that pheromone. It'll go in at night when the bees can't see that well, and they might say, well, this guy doesn't look too good, but at least he smells right. Smells like he belongs here. So they let him pass through. He goes in, siphons off some honey. He does have to get out quickly, though, because the pheromone has a limited duration. It doesn't last all that long. So he's got to be efficient, get past the guard, siphon off some honey, get back out, because if the pheromone disappears, his goose is cooked, so to speak. Okay. So the idea of making yourself smell like something you're not in order to gain an advantage over your opponents, again, is not something that man thought of first. God thought of it first with the death's head moth. Now here we have the Namibian beetle, which lives in a very dry environment, the Namibian desert in Africa. And it is able to extract very efficiently water from fog. Now in the desert, you'll get, because it's right on the seacoast, you'll get fog blowing in off the coast, but it doesn't condense into clouds, it doesn't cause rain. As the day heats up, the fog just simply evaporates, dissipates, and is gone. So you get very little rainfall, but you can get fog blowing in, maybe 2 or 3 times a week off the coast. So the Namibian beetle has this amazing design on its outer surface here of bumps. At the pinnacle of the bumps, it has proteins that are hydrophilic. Hydro meaning water in the Greek, phileo meaning love, means that it loves water. Water loves to condense upon it. But the remainder, these channels in between the bumps, are hydrophobic. In other words, they have proteins that repel water. So the water builds up on the pinnacle and it sloughs off, it gets into these gutters that are hydrophilic, kind of waxy-like, that repel water, and it'll tip up its rear end, so its rear end is facing up, and the water drains down these gutters right into its mouth, condensed right out of the fog. This is incredibly efficient and allows this beetle to live in a desert where most creatures can't live for lack of water. Now, we have had the same idea. We didn't invent it first. God invented it first with the Namibian beetle. But our concept is not as efficient as God's. We used fog nets, and the same basic principle, you get the fog to condense on the fibers of the net and to drain down into a container. And that's all fine and dandy, but they found that the Namibian beetle design, using the pinnacles with a hydrophobic and hydrophilic association, that's 10 times more efficient than our fog nets. So if instead of putting up these nets, we put up panels with those Namibian bumps on them, you get 10 times as much water out of that same fog as you would otherwise. So that's a quantum leap in efficiency. They've also designed now spikes that you can put into a bottle like this, and in the gutters of those spikes, again, they use the Namibian design of little bumps that are hydrophilic on the top and hydrophobic on the bottom. The water condenses and it drains right down into the bottle. An even more efficient design has the whole top of the bottle as well as the spike, having that Namibian beetle design. So you can condense quite a bit of water overnight and have water to drink in the morning. And again, doesn't require any electricity or anything, just using God's amazing design. So how can we efficiently get water in places that are deserts but near a seacoast? taking advantage of all the water in the fog using the Namibian Beetle design. In fact, they're saying now that some places that formerly would be considered uninhabitable can now be inhabited by villages, perhaps even cities, because of this quantum leap in the ability to get much more water out of the fog than we could with our current technology. If we put the Namibian Beetle design on the roofs and on the sides of buildings, you would get a tremendous amount of fresh water every day that the fog is present. And in places where you get a lot of fog, you get a lot of fresh water. There might even be wars fought over fresh water in the future. Fresh water is something that's very, very important and seems to be more and more difficult to find in our world nowadays. So this might be something that will help relieve some of that burden. Again, by copying a design much more efficient than anything we had that God thought of and invented first. Now, does anybody know what this is? Lotus flower, yes. And the lotus flower is not only beautiful, it has an amazing design in its leaves that allow it to be cleaned as good as if it were scrubbed down with detergent every time it simply rains. Now, to figure out how that worked, they looked at it microscopically, and they found that it had all these little pinnacles microscopically on the surface of the leaves. These pinnacles keep water from spreading out on the surface. They have to ball up. And then when they roll off, they pick up dirt. The water picks it up very efficiently. The pinnacles also keep the dirt from adhering to it very well. And so the water simply balls up and rolls off, and as it does, it picks up all that dirt, and it works as good as if you scrubbed it down with detergent. So they thought, that's a nifty design. A paint company by the name of Elizabethan, of course named after Lotus Flower, developed a paint that will produce these type of microscopic pinnacles. And if you paint your house with that, when it rains, notice the first drop comes down, picks up most of the dirt. The ones behind these are almost clear. And the more it rains, the cleaner it gets. You don't have to pay anybody to scrub down your house or whatever. It even has application for car finishes, which I would particularly like. I don't like having to wash my car or pay to have it washed. But if you have this microscopic design, it would still have a beautiful finish. But when it rains, you'd look like you went through a car wash. Just, you know, if it hasn't rained, you simply spray it with a hose. You don't have to scrub it. You don't have to wipe it down. You don't have to use detergent. You'd get this beautiful finish. God thought of it first. And more, I think we're going to see this application taking place. Now, tasers are very good. They're considered a less than lethal weapon. If you have somebody who appears to be violent, making violent threats, but who doesn't have a gun or a knife or some other weapon, you don't want to have to kill them to subdue them. You'd rather subdue them without having to take their life. And so the taser is very effective for that. You get high volts of electricity going through your body, your muscles lock up, you lose control, you fall down, and you can be easily arrested under those type of situations. But using electricity to gain advantage over your opponent and to stun and disable your opponent is not anything new. God thought of it first, of course, with the amazing electric eel. The electric eel is capable of giving a discharge of up to 830 volts, which in most cases stuns its prey, but it can stun creatures as big as crocodiles. So, you know, even the big and the formidable tend to leave the electric eel alone. In some cases, it has actually killed creatures as big as crocodiles. So it's quite amazing. It's not a new idea, though. God thought of it first and put it in the electric eel. Now, here we have the firefly, and fireflies use a phenomenon in nature that's known as bioluminescence, where they use a biochemical compound called luciferin, which sounds like Lucifer, and that's because that was the name of Satan before he fell, was Lucifer, which actually was a good name. It actually means he who emanates light, or the light bearer. And so it uses the chemical compound luciferin, and then it is oxidized by a reaction with the enzyme luciferase, also having that Lucifer type name in it. So luciferase produces oxidative process that's very efficient. It gives off hardly any heat. Now, most of our lights, especially incandescent lights, you know, with tungsten filaments, are notorious for giving off a lot of heat. The problem is the heat is in the infrared spectrum that doesn't help you. You can't see it. It doesn't give up near as much in the visible spectrum. But this bioluminescence gives off almost all of it in the visible spectrum, very little waste to heat, and it's been there from the beginning. Now, back in the early 60s at Bell Laboratories, they thought, gee, that's really really efficient means of lights, maybe we could copy that. So they worked at Bell Laboratories, and one of the engineers there said, well, we don't want to use luciferin and luciferase. That would be too expensive to try to manufacture that, very complicated. So he thought, let's take peroxide and get something else to react with it to get the oxidative effect. They kept trying and trying until they came up with something very effective, and that is used to this day in what we call glow sticks. You break them, it mixes the two compounds, they oxidize, and for quite a while, you have beautiful light. But it's not something man thought of first. God thought of it first and gave that amazing ability not only to the fireflies, but to any other creatures. And there are many multiple creatures, both on land and sea, that have this ability of very efficient bioluminescence. Now, unfortunately, Bell Laboratories made a big mistake. They didn't patent this process, which they should have. So God knows how many millions of dollars they've lost. But you can get them from China now for, really cheap. And of course, they don't have to pay any copyright or patent royalties to do that. So, go to the dollar store, you can get a lot of these for $1. Okay. Now, another thing they found in studying the firefly was that the cuticles, which allow this light to emanate out of its rear there, that they seem to transmit the light very efficiently, more efficiently than our light bulbs do. And so looking at it microscopically, they found there was this specific microscopic geometric pattern in it that seemed to allow the light to come out more efficiently. And that they found that if as an aftermarket process, they would take lasers and put these same type of microscopic geometric patterns on light bulbs, that they could get up to 50% more brightness without an increase in power. So this probably is going to be, a world beater. Even efficient lights like light-emitting diodes, which we have here, you have to cover them, with some kind of a bulb to keep them from being damaged or being touched or get dirty or whatever. But the bulb, even when it appears to be perfectly clear, does inhibit the brightness somewhat. Putting these patterns on bulbs will mean that we'll get the same light for less energy, or you get more light for the same energy without having to pay for brighter light. Either way you want to look at it. It's definitely a more efficient design than we've ever had before, and God invented it first. Here we have the humpback whale. The humpback whales have these big, huge fins, and on the leading edge of these fins, they have these big bumps called tubercles. And it's always been a kind of a puzzle. People thought, well, gee, is that just a weird thing that evolved by mutations, or is it purposeful? Of course, we, believing in God and His creation, feel it must be purposeful. But someone asked the biomimetic question, does this make them more efficient? Now, the humpback whale swims rather lazily, doesn't swim fast like a swordfish or a dolphin. Fast-moving creatures in the ocean, like swordfish and marlin and dolphins, which dolphins are of course mammals, if they're fast-moving, they have curved surfaces that are sleek. But at slower speeds, it appears that this bumpy leading edge that we find here on this particular humpback whale, that actually is more efficient at slower speeds. Somebody thought, well, let's try that out and see if that works. And they tried it out with wind turbines, putting these serrations or bumpy edges on the leading edge of the wind turbines. And lo and behold, they found that with this design, mimicking what we find on the humpback whale, it was 32% more efficient. In other words, the drag was reduced some 32%. Now, how does that pay off? That means that the amount of energy it would take to produce in one of your standard turbines, you'd have to have like a 17 mile per hour wind. But with this new design, because it's much less drag, it can still turn at a relatively good speed to generate enough electricity with only 10 miles per hour instead of 17. And this will actually open up further areas for wind farming, because they may have prevailing winds, but they're not that high velocity. With this very efficient design, even in lower velocity prevailing wind areas, you can set up wind farms and get just as much energy as you can in a high velocity region. So it is very, very good indeed. They also tried this out on ceiling fans. By putting these bumping edges on the leading edges of the ceiling fans, they found a 25% increase in efficiency. So you could either get 25% more air circulated for the same price, or the same amount as normal, but for 25% less on cost. Either way, this is of course going to be adapted into our technology, because it's going to save so much money over time. Now here we have the Emma Maersk. which is the largest container ship in the world. In the front there, you can see, I believe, was a guided missile frigate, Navy guided missile frigate. You can see it's just dwarfed by the size of this huge container ship. This ship is actually about 200 feet longer than a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. It was absolutely huge. Now, in the past, when we made very big ships, we would use multiple propellers. The Titanic had 3 propeller shafts. Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth had 4. But in more recent years, they realized that a very large propeller, although it would turn slower because of its mass, would be very efficient in propelling the water and giving thrust. And so most modern large ships, like the Emma Maersk, have very large single propellers. And this, of course, is also easier to build. Instead of 4 propeller shafts, you just have 1. But you notice the man standing to the side there, okay? This propeller is more than 10 yards across. So if that guy had a football and he threw it to a guy on the other side, it would be a first down, okay? And its diameter is a little bit longer than the height of a 3-story house. So it's very, very huge, very efficient. But because of its large size, like the big wind turbines, they turn relatively slow, but they have a lot of torque and they produce a lot of power. And in a slow turning one like this, if we would put those bumps like we have on the Humpback Whale, you'd get even greater efficiency. And this would especially have application with submarines. The most important thing with a submarine is stealth. So their propellers always turn slow. You never want them to turn too fast or you'll get cavitation, bubbles in the water, and those bubbles, when they pop, give off a lot of sonar energy that can be received by the enemy and is a dead giveaway to your position. So you want to have the most efficient propellers that turn slow. Remember, anything moving through air or water that operates at a relatively slow speed can be enhanced by the Humpback Whale design. So I suspect they're going to incorporate that also, especially on stealthy submarines. So God invented it first, and we have found it works great with wind turbines, with ceiling fans, with propellers, and can even have application in drones. The thing about drones is that they don't need to be, Mach 1 or Mach 2 high-performance fighter aircraft. They're simply designed to loiter in an area, and the greatest feature you want is longevity. You want to have a long time on station, and that requires fuel efficiency. Now, in the case of the Predator drone and its more updated replacement, the Reaper, it's been a real nightmare for the terrorists. Those things are up there, you can't see them, especially at night. They carry Hellfire missiles that can hit the enemy 5 miles away, Griffin missiles almost 10 miles away with laser precision. But the problem is that you can't keep them up there forever. But if we were to put those kind of serrated, bumpy edges on the leading edge of the wings and on the control surfaces, you'd get even more efficiency. You'd be able to remain online even longer. And so the terrorists will have even worse nightmares. Of course, they should simply repent, accept Christ, and it'll be much better anyway. Okay. Now, another creature that moves slow through the water is the basking shark. Well, the reason it's called a basking shark is because it doesn't hardly move around that much, it just kind of basks. But the problem is with fish that move fast through the water, they don't have to worry about bacteria building up colonies on their skin because the velocity of the water will rip off the bacteria. When you move very slow, like the basking shark, it should have problems all the time with bacterial colonies building up and infecting its skin. But it doesn't. Again, people ask the biomimicry question, what do they have that repels bacteria? And they found that it was the structure of the scales. They have these ridges in them called denticles, and that actually physically prohibits the bacteria from attaching to them. So even though they go very slowly through the water, they don't have to worry about bacteria building up on their skin. Somebody got the brilliant idea that that would really help our technology, because one of the biggest problems when you go to a hospital is getting staph infections and other infections. And it's very dangerous because nowadays our antibiotics aren't as effective. The problem is that bacteria especially, the resistance they have has been traced to circular material called plasmids. And usually a minority of them have the right plasmids that have a resistance to the antibiotic. And so all you do is you kill off the ones that don't have it. Then the ones that do have it reproduce, and all of them have it because they reproduce from the ones that have that resistance, and so you got to find some other antibiotic to use, and then soon all you do is kill off the ones that aren't resistant to that. And you end up selectively breeding, so to speak, a superbug that has plasmids that have basically resistance to every known antibiotic practically. So it gets to be rather dangerous when the antibiotics don't work. However, nature repels these bacteria physically. By physical structure, it keeps them from adhering. And so in a hospital, I mean, the statistics are scary. You're more likely to die in a hospital by an infection you get while in the hospital than you are to die in an automobile crash, and combine that with the number of people that die from AIDS. That's a lot of people. So you might want to pray next time you think about going to the hospital. Maybe the Lord will heal you and spare you from going there. However, it may get safer in the future because a company called Sharklet, obviously named after sharks, the Sharklet company said that they have devised a design that mimics the denticel design of the shark scales. And by putting this on utensils, putting it on surfaces in the hospital that are usually touched, this will physically prohibit transmission of bacteria. And you don't have to worry about having your antibiotics. They just won't be able to adhere, it won't be able to transmit. And this should be able to cut down, the more it's adopted, dramatically on hospital-related infections. Again, using design that God thought of first. Oh, I should also mention, before I get out of here, that the Navy has found that this also not only repels bacteria, it works very great in repelling barnacles. Again, these sharks, you never see them with barnacles on them, whereas certain whales, like the humpback whale, barnacles often are all over them. And I think there's some kind of a symbiotic relationship. I don't know exactly what that is, although the barnacles do make them rather formidable. If killer whales come after them, they got these rough barnacles on their fins. If you hit them with it, it does a lot of damage. It might be that kind of a symbiotic relationship. But barnacles with a slow-moving fish like the basking shark should be able to attach to them just like the humpback whale, but they don't. Again, they found it was the denticel design of the shark's scales that keeps the barnacles from attaching. They also found it was more hydrodynamically efficient. So it not only gives it greater efficiency at slow speeds, but it keeps barnacles from attaching. Now, submarines, of course, rely on stealth, and particularly the boomer submarines that carry the intercontinental ballistic missiles. They move very slowly. They don't want, their main weapon is stealth, not being able to know where they are or to detect them. So they move slow anyway. But they do get barnacles on them. And about $100 million a year is spent in dry dock, putting our submarines into dry dock and scraping off barnacles, because the barnacles do destroy hydrodynamic efficiency and cause less speed and more fuel. So the Navy is thinking about putting this design on the hull of ships, the part that's under the water, and the entire surface of submarines to make them not only more hydrodynamically efficient, but also save us millions and millions of dollars scraping off barnacles. God thought of the barnacle barrier long before man ever thought of it, and it works very well indeed. Now here we have glass, and glass is something that's been around for thousands of years. Man probably thought he invented it, but in fact God invented glass first. Paul talks about how in his day he said, we see as through a glass darkly. And when he wrote that, everybody understood what he meant. Now today we say, what do you mean? We can see perfectly through glass. Well, not back in the days of the Roman Empire. They knew how to make glass, but they had not perfected the chemical recipe to make it clear. And so it was always kind of opaque and foggy and could not be seen through very easily. So when Paul said, we see as through a glass darkly, everybody understood, oh yeah, you can't see through glass very well. Everybody knows that. Whereas today, people might say, what in the world does that scripture mean? Well, back then it had a lot more relevance because we're used to clear glass. Back then they didn't have it. But by the days of the Renaissance, they came up with the right chemical recipe to make clear glass. So they started making good quality glass, but man was not the first one to invent it. God invented it first. Nowadays, we even have things like this, a glass house. What an awesome concept. I mean, you have plenty of curtains, you'll notice in there. If you want privacy, you can close the curtains and nobody can see in. But if you're in a rural area where there's hardly anybody around, you're off the beaten path, you can open up all those curtains and not just have a bay window, your whole house is a bay window. And you get this panoramic view everywhere. At night, if your bedroom is up on the top floor, you can look up through the glass and see the beautiful starry sky. What an awesome concept. But even this idea of making a house out of glass is not something new. God invented it first, at the beginning of creation. And here we have a work of art. a starfish made out of glass. But even artwork made out of glass is not something man thought of and invented first. God invented it first with these amazing single-celled creatures called diatoms. Diatoms are little phytoplankton. They're single-celled algae that extract from the water the silica they need to make glass houses. But they aren't just simple squares or rectangles. They're beautiful works of art, such as this that looks very much like a starfish, but it's actually the house of a single-celled algae creature. And there's so many of these diatoms in especially the surface ocean water that if you were to dip down and take a quart jar, in that 1 quart of seawater, you could easily have up to 1 million diatoms. And yet their existence was not even known until we invented the microscope, because they are single-celled microscopic creatures. But they're a very important foundation for the food chain in the ocean. They come in all kinds of sizes and shapes, and just shows, you know, the myriad imagination of God. He incorporated in these little single-celled creatures the DNA instructions to make all kinds of varieties of houses that are just beautiful. Something that looks like artwork, architecture. It looks and screams out intelligent design. And yet it's a beauty that we haven't even seen until relatively modern times with the invention of the microscope. The scripture says it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it is the glory of kings to discover it. And we have been able to discover much of his amazing engineering and aesthetic beauty that lay hidden for many centuries. As you can see, many of these have rather geometric shapes: triangles, circles, squares, rectangles, and tremendous variety and color. Just awesomely beautiful things at the microscopic scale. But it's not just the diatoms. Also, we have creatures that are noted for graceful curving structures as well. And these are zooplankton, which are animals that don't use photosynthesis like the single-celled algae, the diatoms. They are more like kind of amoebas. They'll eat and metabolize food. But they have all kinds of beautiful swirling, curving structures, very aesthetically pleasing. This actually is one of the rare forms of a diatom that has this type of swirling architecture to it. But the radiolaria, composed primarily of silicate dioxide, basically glass, and there's a rich variety of these, but it was even richer in the past. We find in their remains that we find at the bottom of ocean sediments, some change in the ocean, perhaps after the flood, with change in temperature, pH, or whatever, caused a number of them to go extinct. But we still have a lot of them that are incredibly beautiful and intricate. These are actually drawings by the famous scientist Ernst Haeckel, who was a very accomplished artist. He was an evolutionist scientist, but he was certainly a very accomplished artist. And many of these we don't find living today, but we do find the remains at the bottom of the ocean, showing there was even a richer variety of these in the past. And these are just beautiful works of art. I mean, this looks kind of like a hot air balloon. This looks maybe like a bird feeder of some kind. This looks like a chandelier. This looks like a fat bumblebee with short wings. All three of these look like, you know, beautiful gazebos. These, I don't know exactly what these look like, but I know they sure don't look like they happened by chance. They don't look like random mutations, natural selection produced this exquisite aesthetic beauty that God has placed there for us to enjoy in the last days with the invention of the microscope. And we find ones that look every bit like they'd belong on a Christmas tree. They look like beautiful works of art that you would love to put at the top of your Christmas tree or hang on your Christmas tree. Imagine if you had these hanging on your tree and somebody said, "Wow, look at that beautiful glass artwork. Please tell me, who's the artist that did this?" Oh, there's no artist. You see, at a glass manufacturing plant, they had an explosion. And the explosion kind of randomly reprogrammed their computer code that they used to get the blueprints for these glass ornaments. And when they stuck it in after the explosion, look what came out. You know, I mean, nobody would believe that. They'd say, "Man, you're wacky. You know, that never happens." But they look at this today and say, "Oh, look what nature, blind, random, destructive mutations, natural selection supposedly did." You know, they turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to the obvious evidence of not just form and function, engineering design that works, but aesthetic beauty that doesn't have to be there to survive. Why is there this amazing ornate beauty when it is not necessary for survival. They could have a glass house like the one I showed you. It's just a cube. It's not pretty, it's not, frilly, it's not aesthetically pleasing particularly, but it functions just fine for survival. But so many times in nature we see beauty that is there because God is aesthetic in his nature. And we appreciate it because being made in the image of God, we appreciate aesthetics. Because like him, we have that capacity, something the animals I don't believe necessarily have. Okay, so more of Ernst Haeckel's work. Here we have other radiolarian glass houses. This one here has actually been used as the inspiration for making jewelry pendants, such as these. Here we have a radiolarian queen with a radiolarian crown, radiolarian bottle, radiolarian garments. And this particular radiolarian was copied here in conversation pieces that they use. You can use them for containers too. These others copy other radiolarian designs as well. Here we have a chalice and decanters that use this basic design of a radiolarian and copied it very effectively. This one is just cool looking, and one artist thought, we'll just copy that in aluminum and have a nice little piece of artwork, a direct copy basically. It's found in wrought iron artistry in a number of places where artists have felt they couldn't improve on it, so they would just copy it. This one was actually used as inspiration for a pavilion at the French International Exposition in 1900. And this is what the pavilion looks like, again, copying that basic design. Some copy them directly. They figure, why try to improve on perfection? And this is made out of actually colored bronze, but it's pretty much an exact copy of this particular type of radiolarian. Glass blowers said, well, these originally are made out of glass. Why don't we copy them with glass blowing? And so you can find glass blowers who will copy the radiolarian design. Because they are so beautiful, they get put on t-shirts and everything else. Perhaps the purest form of artistry with them is to put them on microscope slides and arrange them. And if you have a good quality microscope, you can look at them directly, not a copy, but the way God originally made them. Oops, the wrong thing there. There we go. Now these are diatoms simply arranged in a circle on a microscopic slide, but the rich variety and the beauty is undeniable. Here again we have radiolarian structures arranged in a kind of a flower petal pattern. Here we have actually a Victorian style star, and this is by Diatom Shop. If you want to find these, just go on the internet and type in diatom or radiolarian art, and it'll bring up some of these. If you have microscopes, it might be worth getting some of these slides. Again, God has his artwork. We arrange it into further artwork because it is just gorgeous. They're like little beautiful microscopic jewels that can be arranged by man with his own aesthetic desires to make it very pleasing, very beautiful indeed. But God thought of it first. So God was the first one to invent glass. He was the first one to invent houses out of glass with both the diatoms and the radiolaria. And he also was the first one to invent artwork, beautiful, beautiful artwork out of glass. God invented it first. Now here we have the Great Pyramid in Egypt, which for thousands of years was the tallest man-made structure on Earth until later in the Middle Ages, when they started building some of the great cathedrals, they finally rivaled and even surpassed the height of the Great Pyramid. Now it has deteriorated somewhat over the centuries, but it's estimated to have been about 480 feet originally before it lost some of its top structure. That's pretty tall, there's no doubt about that, and it took man clear up until the dawn of the 20th century to actually build something twice as tall as the Great Pyramid, and that was the Eiffel Tower, built in 1889. Ironically, it was built for the Paris Exposition. It was only supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be dismantled and taken away. And a lot of people said, it's an eyesore, it's terrible, and yet I'm glad they preserved it. To this day, it is the symbol of Paris and even of France itself. But it took a long time, till nearly the dawn of the 20th century, to build something twice as big as the pyramids. Then, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a ability to process steel much more efficiently and cost effectively made steel widely available, and they, for the first time in history, started making massive skyscrapers out of steel. The Chrysler building back here in 1930, when it was built, was briefly the tallest skyscraper in the world, but in 1931 they completed the one in the foreground here, the Empire State Building, and it remained the tallest skyscraper in the world for a little over 40 years. What replaced it after that was the tallest? Anybody know? World Trade Center, which no longer stands. But for over 40 years, that was the tallest structure man had ever made. But God was the first one to invent skyscrapers. When you take into account the mass and the height compared to the size of the workers, proportionate to the size of the workers who built it, the tallest structures in the world are still these, termite mounds. The tallest termite mounds in the world are found in tropical regions of Australia and Africa. And they don't appear all that tall compared to humans. We have to remember the workers who built this are blind termites. They're blind. And yet they've been given such incredible wisdom by God that they can build these tall, tough structures. And termites average only about 1/3 of an inch long. So when you take how many termites you have to stack end to end to equal the height, and you get that ratio, at that ratio, how high would the Empire State Building be compared to the size of termites? Well, it'd only be that big. That's it. The termites would not be very impressed with what was the tallest structure in the world for over 40 years compared to what they build. It's a pipsqueak, okay? Now, not only are they tall, they're very strong. African elephants can weigh easily 5 to 6 tons or even more, and they love to come up and rub their itching rears on termite mounds, because if you've ever felt a termite mound, it's very rough. It's almost like the surface of rock or concrete. It's very hard. And it's made out of an amazing recipe, dirt and dung and the saliva of the termites. Their termite saliva has special binding proteins in it that act like a kind of an amazing biological super glue. And the mixture is very potent, very strong, and you can have, a 6-ton elephant come up and lean against it and rub his rear, and the thing doesn't disintegrate. It holds up under that tremendous pressure. So they're not only very tall proportionately, they're incredibly strong. Now, the tallest skyscraper ever built in history to the present is this one in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, the Hajj Khalif. Anybody know how tall this one is? It's a little over 1/2 mile tall. Yeah, so it dwarfs the Empire State Building, the former World Trade Center. It is the tallest ever made. Yet, in proportion to the size of the workmen who build it, say an average steel worker is maybe 6 feet tall, how tall would it be proportionately to the biggest termite mounds the termites have made? Well, the biggest termite mounds are found in Africa, and some of them are up to 40 feet in diameter at the base and can get up to 25 feet tall. You can see the giraffe in the background for perspective. Giraffes typically get up to about 18 feet tall, so taller than giraffes. And when you look at the size of the termites, how big is this? Well, if we were to compare the proportionate size of the Hajj Khalif, our tallest skyscraper in the world, it would only be about that big, about half. So we'd have to build a skyscraper in excess of 1 mile high to be able to beat what God has done with the termites. God invented skyscrapers first and gave this ability to blind little insects that average only about 1/3 of an inch long. Amazing. Now, termite mounds aren't just there to be impressive edifices, they actually have a purpose. The termites like to cultivate a certain fungus that they eat. They do eat wood fiber, but they also like to eat this fungus. But the fungus is very touchy temperature-wise. It won't grow effectively at the wrong temperature, and it won't even grow at all if you don't have very tightly regulated temperature. The termites build this mound and are able to regulate the temperature so precisely that it stays within 1 degree plus or minus of the optimum temperature for this fungus to grow. That's pretty amazing. Now, they use the differential heating. The big termite mound, of course, is up here getting the rays of the sun, heating up. Of course, warm air rises, so that produces a draft. As the air rises out of the openings in the termite mound, it draws from these vents that are under the ground. These that are deeper under the ground, of course, is cool. So you have the warm air rising, and then it pulls in, sucks in this air from these vents, coming through the cool ground, it cools down the air. And they open and close these little openings. All these little blind creatures scurrying around with their own built-in biological thermometers that can sense temperature precisely, and they regulate it as good as any of our thermostats within plus or minus 1 degree of the optimum temperature. And they know exactly how to open and close to maintain that precisely. I don't think that amazing wisdom got there by blind random destructive mutations. I think God had a hand at that. In fact, it is not acknowledged to be such good design. Here in Wikipedia, they talk about the termite model for using air conditioning in a building using differential heating, where hot air rising vents out and pulls air from underground to cool it. This has actually been employed in a couple of large buildings, well known. This one up here is in the capital city of Zimbabwe, Africa. This one actually is in London, England, there at the bottom. You notice both of them have these big chimney-like features up on the top, look kind of like chimneys. But they're not chimneys, they're vents. And this allows the warm air to rise up and escape out, and it pulls the cool air from under the ground. Now, unfortunately, we can't put big, deep shafts in the ground when you're in an urban setting because you violate other people's space. So they have to use fans to get some of that air going from underground. But even with the use of fans, this termite design is so efficient that it saves 90% in efficiency over what a regular air conditioning system would cost to run. 90%. Both of these were built back in the mid-1990s. And in the several decades since they were built, both of them have saved their owners multiple millions of dollars in what it would have cost by a standard air conditioning system, simply by copying the far more efficient design that God gave to termites. Now here we have a coil spring, and this is supposed to have been invented by man back in the 1700s to replace the leaf spring. Coil spring in certain applications works much better than the leaf spring. But again, it's not something man thought of and invented first. God invented the coil spring first. And he invented it and put it in our ears. And if we didn't have these microscopic coil springs in our ears, you wouldn't be able to hear the words that I'm saying today. Now, the amazing thing the evolutionists believe is that the very intricate, very advanced audio system of mammals evolved from that of reptiles. Now, mammals and humans have this 3 earbone articulated system that attaches to the eardrum, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, or more technically, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And they have to believe, since in reptiles you have a single ear bone, the columella, and they have to believe that bones were actually taken, dislodged out of the jawbone of the reptiles, have multiple jawbones, but supposedly jawbones were drawn out, shrunk down, articulated, and interacted together to form this marvelous structure here of these intricate ear bones. Well, how in the world is the thing supposed to be able to eat when its jaw is being dislodged? And how long would it take for evolution to perfect that? In the meantime, you're deaf, which isn't exactly good for survival value. And why would you need to involve this anyway for survival? Evolutionists claim that reptiles have been surviving fine for millions of years. Why would they need to go through all this hassle of losing, jaw bones out of their jaw, so their jaw isn't going to work very well, if at all, and sticking them up into their ear where they don't work until they're essentially perfect and you're deaf in the meantime? Why go through that when you can survive for millions of years without it? There simply is no reason that for survival of the fittest this would need to even evolve, even if it could. I don't think blind random destructive mutations could have pulled that off. But we find in the human ear system that the eardrum receives vibrations, transmits through these intricate ear bones to this amazing organ in here, the cochlea. Looks kind of curled up like a snail shell. Inside the cochlea is an organ that is unique to mammals. It's not found at all in reptiles. It would have to evolve de novo. In other words, from no pre-existing organ being modified, but something that never existed, and then it grows there from nothing, not using anything previously existing. And that organ is called the organ of Corti, and exists there in the cochlea. It is the most intricate and amazing system in the mammalian ear. And it's especially intricate in humans. I believe because humans are made in the image of God, we have an appreciation of aestheticism that most animals don't. And as a result, we can appreciate beautiful nuances of music. And with this very intricate system, it allows us to enjoy that in a way I think that no other creatures God made could, except for perhaps angels. Anyway, the organ of Corti We'll give you a close-up of it here. It has these cells with hairs protruding out of them connecting to this top surface up here. And there's 4 different sets. Now these look like there's just 3 of each. That's simplification for this graphic. There's actually anywhere between 18,000 to 23,000 in each one of those strands there. And they come in pairs. They have a short hair and a long hair. And it looks like this. Now the long hair is very much affected by vibration coming through the ear. And as the long hair vibrates, it's attached to the short hair by this little device here. Not just a cable, but a true coiled spring. And what comes up through this short hair here is a progression of positively charged ions, protons. And so every time the long hair wiggles, it pulls on this spring, and the spring opens this trap door and allows 1 proton to come in. And this can vibrate, open and shut that door up to 20,000 times a second. Really high-pitched music or noise, bzzz, 20,000 times a second. But each time the trap door opens and a proton comes in, being positively charged, it changes the electrical properties of the inner ear and sends an electrical message to your brain that is interpreted as noise or music or conversation. If you didn't have those little springs opening and closing those doors, you would not be able to hear the words that I'm speaking today. God invented the spring first, not out of steel or bronze or anything else, but out of a very complex, incredibly durable molecular configuration of proteins. And they last pretty good. Most people can hear pretty well most of their lives. Eventually, we do get old and wear out, but I'll tell you, these springs have a lot more durability than anything we've ever made. God not only invented it first, He invented it better. And if we didn't have these springs, we would not be able to enjoy the pleasure of sound and music and conversation. Now, Janine Benyus, she has a lot of programs on the internet. She's a great proponent of biomimicry. But again, she doesn't give the glory to God. She says biomimicry can be defined as sustainable innovation inspired by nature, not produced by God. In fact, she has gone so far as to say publicly, nature is the creator of this amazing world. Well, just saying it doesn't make it so. Just turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to the amazing creations of God and the fact that it outstrips even our technology and gives every earmark of being intelligently designed, just dismissing it doesn't make sense, but that is indeed what they do. She would agree with Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner, sharing that prize for discovering the double helical structure of DNA. Francis Crick said biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Well, what if the design outstrips everything we have ever done? What if it's more complex than anything we've ever achieved, which even the tiniest simple bacterium is not simple, because it's far more complex than any machine we've ever made, and it can do things none of our machines can do, such as autonomous replication. It's able to build itself, maintain itself, stasis, repair itself, and reproduce itself without any outside help or maintenance. Can anybody conceive of making a machine that would run and keep reproducing and keep on going for thousands of years without any outside maintenance or repair? It's inconceivable that we could make such a machine. Yet even the tiniest little single cell has those capabilities that we cannot match even in the 21st century. And they have the gall and audacity to tell us, well, you got to believe that happened by chance and natural laws. Well, really, just put up or shut up. Let's have some mathematics that shows that makes sense. The mathematics says it's impossible, even on the cosmic scale, even on trillions of universe scale. It wouldn't work, no matter how much time you have. And the laws of chemistry and physics, second law of thermodynamics, laws of hydrolysis, laws of chemical cross-reaction, all say it can't work. And the experiments done by Louis Pasteur proved that life only comes from pre-existing life. The law of biogenesis says you can't get life from non-living material. That's a biological law, but they turn a blind eye and a deaf ear. They say, well, under the right circumstances, it can happen. Really? Show us the math, show us the laws of chemistry and physics, show us the experiments that make it scientific. Just saying it doesn't make it scientific. We can show you the math, the physics, the experiments that shows intelligent design works every doggone time. That's scientific. Where's the math, the science, and the experiments to show otherwise? They don't. They just, well, we have the majority on our side. Fine. That's a textbook example of a fallacy of logic. Argumentum ad populum. We have the majority must be true. Well, the majority has been dead wrong many times in the past. And when it comes to questions that involve our eternal destiny, you better have something better than a textbook logical fallacy to back up what you believe, because what you believe does have consequences. Now, when we look at the world of biology, pardon me?
Do we have time for a break?
Oh yes, actually I'm at the end. So yeah, we're at the end, that's, yeah. Okay, so we'll have a longer break. So when we look at the world of biology, we not only see design, genius, and engineering, but we see a level of technology and complexity that cannot be matched even today in the 21st century. And there therefore must be a higher power and a higher intelligence behind it. God puts it this way in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, "For ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature and attributes, that is his eternal power and divinity, have been made intelligible and clearly discernible in and through the things that have been made, his handiworks." Today we've looked at just some of his amazing handiworks, and indeed it shows that men are without excuse, altogether without any justification, if they dare to believe that it could have happened without an intelligent God behind it. I don't think there'd be anything more insulting than for somebody to look at the Mona Lisa in the Louvre in Paris and say, oh, you know how that happened? Somebody threw paint on that canvas centuries ago, and the laws of chemistry and physics interacted with the chemistry of the paint and the canvas and mathematical probability, and look, you have the smiling maiden. People would say, no, that's a fairy tale for adults. We never see a masterpiece unless an intelligent master artist did it. And when you see something like that, it's unconscionable and inexcusable to claim it happened by natural forces when all of history shows natural forces cannot do that. Science is what you can see, test, and observe, and prove to be true. What science proves is that intelligence can do things that time and chance and natural laws of chemistry and physics can never do. And it's just utterly without any excuse at all for men to believe that. Anyway, I do have this available, all four in this series. Biomimetics means God invented it first, and we'll go ahead and have a long break since that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.